And we should be live. Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and your host, Adam Taggart, welcoming you here for a special report on the action that's been going on in Venezuela this week. We're very fortunate to be joined again by RANE Latin America geopolitical analyst, Mario Braga. Mario, thank you so much for taking the time in what I'm sure must be a very busy time for you to talk to the Thoughtful Money audience.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in the show.
All right. Well, look, Mario, for those that didn't see it, you were kind enough to come on about a month ago or so and update us on the situation in Venezuela. This was right as the U.S. was starting to really build up its naval blockade of the country. We talked about kind of the history of how things got to the point in Venezuela where they were being run by Maduro and the infrastructure was, failing and 8 million people had fled the country and all that stuff. So folks, if you want a deep dive kind of in the history of how Venezuela got to where it is today, go back and listen to that special report. We talked about the odds of the U.S. forcibly deposing Maduro, and correct me if I'm misremembering here, Mario, but it sounded like at that time that was sort of the lower probability option that RANE thought was going to happen. They thought it was going to be more, targeted strikes on cartel assets and things like that, but just putting more military pressure on Maduro and maybe trying to negotiate, some sort of compliance from him. But not necessarily, in a military excursion to forcibly remove him from power. That turned out to be what happened. So what we're going to talk about today is, okay, so now that we've pulled the leader out of Venezuela, one, if you could just give us sort of a quick snapshot on what exactly the state of affairs is right now. And then I'd like to talk with you about sort of all the implications of this, what's going to happen in terms of who's going to lead Venezuela, how sticky of an issue could this become for the U.S., what the impact's going to be geopolitically, how the rest of the world is reacting to this, economically, does this mean big things for the energy markets or other parts of the global economy? So we'll get into all those, and then folks, the last time with Mario, we pre-recorded it. This is a live stream, so I want to leave some generous time here for audience questions as well. So Mario, I guess just to sort of start things off, what is the current state of play right now with Venezuela?
Sure. Thanks again, Adam. So basically what we had is that on Saturday, the 3rd of January, we had the U.S. carry out a military and law enforcement operation, as the Trump administration has been framing it, to not only carry out strikes in Venezuela, mostly around the capital Caracas, but also to capture and extract then President Nicolás Maduro. He was then taken to the U.S. and is now facing charges. What that consists of, what kind of the results of that is that you had a power vacuum in Venezuela. So who is the president now? Who is going to lead the country? There was a lot of uncertainty over the weekend. But right on Sunday, so on the following day, the Supreme Court ordered that Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, should take up the role of interim president for 90 days.
All right, and I'm sorry, the Supreme Court of the U.S. or of Venezuela? Who wrote this?
The Supreme Court of Venezuela ordered that following the country's constitutional process. But that's not only enough in a country where the military has a strong power. The last time I joined the show, we were discussing the different factions that sustained Maduro in power. And one of them is the armed forces, which are led by Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. But Venezuela also has a lot of paramilitary forces. It has the Bolivarian militia. It has the armed so-called colectivos, which are civilians that follow orders by Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello. So you had different factions and groups that could fight for power, and this could lead to internal disputes, internal struggles, even an armed conflict. So there was a lot of uncertainty in these initial hours. But after the Venezuelan Supreme Court ordered Delcy to become the interim president, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, issued a statement saying that the armed forces recognized her as the leader of the country. And then from there, you had a slightly less tense and less uncertain, but still highly uncertain scenario. So the state of play is Delcy Rodriguez is now the acting president. She was the vice president under Maduro. And all the apparatus of the regime, so all the ministers, all the kind of these paramilitary forces, they are still in place. So we cannot necessarily talk about regime change just by the removal of Maduro from Caracas and from Venezuela, because all the rest of the government and military structures are still in place. And then we can discuss in detail why that is the case, what seems to be the Trump administration's rationale. But the situation now is that Delcy Rodriguez is the president, and it seems that there have been conversations between her and the Trump administration on how things should proceed from now on.
Okay. So I think a question that a lot of people have is, all right, so as we understand it, Venezuela held elections, I can't remember when, a year or two ago. Pardon me?
July 2024.
Okay, July 2024. And Maduro did not win, but he held on to power anyways. And the party or the person who won was this woman, I'm forgetting her first name, but Machado was her last name. Folks might recognize the name because she was the person who won the Nobel Peace Prize a few months back. And so she was sort of a leader in exile, right? And she has a guy, I can't remember his name, I'm sure you'll share it with us, who's kind of her proxy inside the country. And she is, has been working with the rest of the global community, as you shared with us last time, she's got a very detailed plan about how Venezuela should be run, and it could re-engage much more with the global economy and be a lot more friendly to a lot of other countries. And they've got a game plan for that she's been selling. I think a lot of people thought, okay, well, gosh, the Trump administration is just going to put her in power and hand the torch to her. But Trump said, no, she doesn't have the support inside the country. And that surprised a lot of people. I'd love to hear your explanation as to why you think the administration is not choosing her. Just to tack onto that question, last time you were here, you explained again the history of how Maduro rose to power within Venezuela. And as part of that process, he was Chavez's successor. And during both the Chavez regime and the Maduro regime, they basically stacked the entire deck in the power structure of the country with their cronies. So everybody in the political system, everybody in the military, everybody in the judiciary, everybody in the local police forces. And you had said it's tough to force regime change on the country, because if you remove the head of the snake, you still have the whole rest of the snake that's aligned with kind of the Maduro way of doing things. And so was part of Trump's decision was, hey, I can't just remove one head and put a different head on it because it's got a snake body that's going to reject it.
Yeah, you're right, Adam. That's the rationale behind what seems to be the decision-making process of the Trump administration. So to get the kind of the storyline together, basically, we had in July 2024, the presidential elections in Venezuela, which were part of a broader agreement that the Biden administration was trying to get Maduro on the table with other stakeholders in like Brazil as well, Colombia. There was the Barbados Agreement. Maduro, back in, I think, 2023, late 2023, said, okay, I will hold free and fair elections. The opposition will be able to run. Then we'll see who wins. And in exchange for that, the U.S. would reduce economic sanctions. And that seems to be a way for a transition to democracy, right? Because if you have free and fair elections, the opposition wins, Maduro is out of power. Mm-hmm. But then what happened following this agreement is that Maduro did not deliver. So he try to repress the opposition. He prevented the most popular opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, as you mentioned, who now just won the Nobel Prize. She was barred from running. So what the opposition did was they united behind one of the few single candidates that was still allowed to run, because Maduro thought he was so unpopular that he would never win. That's Edmundo González Urrutia. He was a diplomat, and he was kind of unknown to most Venezuelans. But despite not being on the ticket, Maria Corina Machado ran the campaign. She was going across the country. She gathered large crowds. And most importantly, the opposition managed to have kind of a structure of allies in all the kind of the ballots and the center, so they could get the receipts of the votes. And they proved that the results that Maduro claimed that he had won the election were false, because with the receipts they were able to show that in fact González Urrutia got 67% of the vote. But as you mentioned, Maduro controls the entire apparatus, the government, the electoral bodies, the judiciary, the military. So the official version that he had won prevailed. He remained in power, taking office in January 2025. And in this mindset of an authoritarian regime with repression, González Urrutia fled to Spain. He was recognized as president-elect, but he left the country. And Maria Corina Machado remained in hiding in Venezuela up until late 2025, when she left the country to the Nobel ceremony in Norway, in Oslo. Now the two of them are outside the country, so you don't have an opposition leader in Venezuela. And when we focus on what was the Trump decision-making process, there are reports, media reports, showing that the CIA assessed the scenario. And if you have the option of having Maria Corina Machado, who is friendly to the US, she was proposing the privatization of state-owned companies. She was proposing opening up the oil and gas sector. She was talking about 1.7 trillion investment opportunity over 10 to 30 years. So she was friendly. But the question was, would she be able to deliver? We're talking about a country, as I said before, in which the armed forces play a strong role, in which you have paramilitary forces. And Maria Corina Machado, although she's popular among the population, she does not control or have influence over these other parts of the state. So the assessment seems to be that, well, if we remove Maduro and we make right away a transition to democracy in which we recognize the 2024 election results, in which González Urrutia takes office and Maria Corina is a strong kind of stakeholder within this government, they would highly likely be challenged by the security apparatus. This could lead, as I said before, a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty. There could be a coup to oust them. There could be an internal armed conflict. There could be a highly uncertain environment that is not favorable to businesses. And it seems that the Trump administration for now has prioritized, as we saw in President Trump's statements, the opportunities that the Venezuelan oil sector can provide. So instead, the calculation was, well, we can remove Maduro, and now he's in the US, he'll face charges. We'll leave the entire apparatus in place, because this is an apparatus that, although has not been friendly to the US, it gets the state running, right? So things are under control. There was a severe economic decline that led to the immigration of millions of Venezuelans, like nearly 8 million since 2016. But the rationale is, if they are there, and because the US has the naval buildup in the Caribbean, a lot of kind of military personnel deployed, because they have carried out the operation that extracted Maduro, they have the leverage to pressure the new government to play ball, to appease and meet Washington's demands. So it seems that now their preferred path was, we keep things in place and we get them, the new government, to play by our rules or our interests or our demands. And this is what we have seen in recent days. And because, just to wrap this part, on the Venezuelan side, you have like Delcy Rodriguez. She's a loyal to the socialist revolution. She has been in positions in the government since 2003 under former President Hugo Chavez. She has made a lot of strong criticisms to the U.S. She has said that Venezuela will not be a colony. It's now, like after the extraction of Maduro, she demanded Maduro's release. But all of them, not only her, the high-ranking officials in the government and in the military, they are afraid that what happened to Maduro could happen to them.
Right.
They are afraid that if the regime collapses, they would face charges both in Venezuela and or in the US for illegal activities, illegal drug trafficking, for human rights violations, even for terrorism. So for them now, the calculation is, well, maybe it's better for us to cooperate with Washington and prevent the regime from falling than the other option that would be a democratic transition. They get voted out, and then they would face the consequences. So that's kind of how things seem to be placed to play out in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, so to continue to murder my analogy, rather than chop the head off the snake, graft a brand new head on it, and then risk the body of the snake rejecting the new head and Venezuela descending into kind of Lord of the Flies, failed state territory. Instead, we said, okay, look, we're going to keep the whole snake in place, minus Maduro, but we're going to put our hand firmly around its neck and squeeze and say, snake, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And it seems like the main levers there are, okay, we're now taking over your oil infrastructure. So if you want to continue to get revenue from your own oil industry, it's going to come through us. We can turn it on, we can turn it off. And then secondly, missiles and special forces. You saw what happened to Maduro. You do something we don't like, you might be the next one pulled out in a midnight raid, or you might just find a missile in your bedroom, right? So you're nodding here, but that's pretty much the control mechanism we now have or the U.S. now has in place over Venezuela.
Yeah, it's basically an option for some sort of coercion, right? Because on Saturday, on the same day of the operation, President Trump gave a press conference, and then he said the U.S. will run Venezuela. And then a lot of people were asking, okay, how will that play out? Will he appoint, for example, Marco Rubio to be in charge? And later, what we had, even statements from Rubio himself, is that will not be kind of an official position that the U.S. will become kind of a governing Venezuela, but that the U.S. officials, the Trump administration, will and then air quotes like work closely with Caracas, with the new government, Delcy Rodriguez, the new president, so the new government adopts policies that are aligned with what the White House thinks should be the priorities for Caracas. And then there have been media reports since the weekend that give a hint on what we can expect to be these priorities. So I'm just going to refer to some of the notes that I have here.
Okay. But and while you're plugging them up, let me just ask this. So it kind of sounds like the U.S. or the administration's coterie, whoever's going to be tasked with this, Rubio and others, they're going to be like a board of directors. And they're essentially going to give the president the marching orders. Okay, this is the strategic direction. These are the policies we want. And they want her to say, okay, got it, boss. I'm going to go execute.
Yeah, informally, that's the design. And that's what we expect Delcy Rodriguez to do. And that's still to be seen if that will actually work. But from media reports, what we have is that so far in these background conversations, government officials from the United States have outlined three main priorities for the new president of Venezuela. The first is fight drug trafficking. We know this has been a major priority across Latin America. The second is removing from Venezuela operatives from countries that are hostile to the US. So Iran and Cuba, namely, but from other countries as well. We know, as we discussed the first time I was on the show, that Cuba runs the counterintelligence services in Venezuela, that 32 Cubans and kind of officials died because they were basically the bodyguards of Maduro. So there are operatives from Iran, from Cuba there. Washington wants them out. And then the third priority is to stop the shipment of oil to countries that are adversaries to the US. And that can include also Cuba, because the Venezuelan oil provides the lifeline to the Cuban regime. But a lot of Venezuelan oil also goes to China, for example. It accounts for 4% of China's oil imports. So, of course, China can still get this oil from elsewhere, but that's still a disruption. So these are the three top priorities. And then later, what we had is that yesterday, President Trump announced on Truth Social a deal, and this has not been confirmed from the Venezuelan side, but basically Trump said that Venezuela will turn over between 30 million and 50 million barrels of oil. This would be worth between $2 billion and $2.8 billion. Basically, the US would get this oil, would sell at market price, and would put this the proceeds in a fund that would be run by the US government. And then when Trump posted it, he said that the proceeds would be used to the benefit of the people of both countries. And then later we had, just a couple of hours ago, Energy Secretary Chris Wright saying, kind of confirming this, that there would be a structure, a fund to which the revenue would go, and it would be used in favor of Venezuela. So it's still uncertain how this will actually play out, and if Caracas will confirm this deal, but there are steps that are indicating how the situation is likely to evolve.
Okay. And that sounds kind of like classic Trump of like, hey, whatever costs the U.S. might endure from getting involved in Venezuela, the Venezuelans are going to pay for it, right? Mm-hmm. It'll be funded by Venezuela's own oil. Yeah. Okay, so let's see here. So with Machado, the thought was, hey, we don't want to put her in too soon and have the whole system reject her. So presumably the country's going to have elections, right? That presumably that's a big priority of the U.S. is hey, let's get democratic elections held at some point soon, and then eventually a democratically elected leader will get in, and then they'll be able to continue to drive these reforms. Why do they think putting in a democratic leader in the future versus now will work any differently? Is that because they want time to kind of force, by choking the snake to kind of, foam the runway for the new leader? Are they trying to give everybody who's kind of in power right now and afraid of what would happen if government changes, because all of a sudden there's a target on their back? Is it just to give them time to kind of decide, hey, what country do I want to escape to? Why should we expect a democratic leader, if they're put in 3 months or 6 months or whatever, to be any more successful than if they put Machado in today?
Yeah, it's hard to tell exactly what went on in this decision and kind of the different drivers that influenced it. So I can't really say that there is like one single reason or why they prefer this over that. Like the broader rationale, as I said before, is that they opted for what the CIA assessed to be a more stable scenario. And this, of course, according to media reports, that there was a CIA assessment showing that under DLC, she would be more able to keep the state under control, and that would be a more stable scenario. And then there is still an open question of when there will be elections, and even if these elections that are still to be scheduled will be, for example, free and fair, or if the US will be comfortable with the current government again trying to rig the election to stay in power. We still don't know. According to the Venezuelan constitution, when the president is absent and you have a new president, the new president should call elections in 30 days. We have not heard anything so far that would be the case. So it's hard to say that they could call elections in 30 days, but as you said, these could be elections scheduled for the second half of the year. So it's still early days, and we haven't seen the indications that a concrete transition to democracy is actually going to occur. Because there is also the potential scenario in which, as I said before, the current members of the regime, they get too afraid of regime collapse, of US intervention, of another extraction, or US military strikes, and then they just go along with Trump's demands. We anticipate that Delcy Rodriguez will continue to make these harsh speeches, to continue to criticize the Trump administration, but she's not going to cross the line and break these background conversation channels, because that would be too high of a risk. Trump has said that she would pay even a higher price than Maduro did. So there is this constant pressure. And in a scenario in which the new government in Caracas, let's say they meet all of these demands that seem to be on the table, maybe the Trump administration will be comfortable with that. So it's hard to tell how, especially when you think about a longer, we have put out a piece, an analysis for the next 3 to 6 months, because then we have more visibility. Yeah. And one of the scenarios is over the next 3 to 6 months, she can make this very tricky balancing act of appeasing Washington, but at the same time, she cannot displease the hardliners within the regime, for example, because she would risk a coup, a military coup that could try to oust her for being overly friendly to the United States. So it's a very tricky balancing act, and that's why there is also a persistent uncertainty on how things can evolve.
Okay. There's an argument to be made where, Trump may have done this because he sort of says, what's my downside, right? I've got this regime that's thumbing its nose at me and doing all sorts of things I don't want it to do. And it's got, my adversaries, it's opening itself to my adversaries and all that stuff. So let me grab that guy, right? Let me hopefully, scare the country into, or the leadership of the country into towing whatever line I want, and I get, I take over their oil and all that stuff, right? And if they fall into line, great. That's way better than what I had before. If they eventually have democratic elections, whether it's 3 months or 3 years from now, and the country becomes much more democratic and U.S. friendly, even better. But you know what? If the hardliners take out this president and this new president, and they put their own hardliner person in there, it's really no different than what I had before. Right? So you can kind of make the argument there wasn't a lot of downside to this.
Yeah, the operation itself. When we were discussing last time I was on the show about the potential scenarios, as you mentioned earlier, we anticipated that the first strikes, for example, would be on drug trafficking assets, drug camps, like airstrips or ports. And then it's interesting because in late December, there was one of these strikes, a drone strike in Venezuelan territory. But the operation, the extraction itself, showed a much higher risk appetite from the Trump administration, because it's a highly complex military operation with more than 150 kind of aircraft, the different elements involved. They departed from 20 different bases. So this showed that the Trump administration was willing to take a high risk to have the political win of removing Maduro. And that's the kind of perhaps one of the lingering questions, that perhaps that is a victory that's enough for them, at least for now. And then when we think about the longer term, we have to remember Secretary of State Marco Rubio is of Cuban descent. How the situation in Venezuela and broader across Latin America of leftist autocracies, this is something that is a sensitive topic for voters in Florida. So all of these elements will likely become drivers for the future decision making as the situation evolves. We have this year elections for governor and I think for the Senate in Florida as well. So who knows if a stronger approach to Venezuela and perhaps even to Cuba will be something that the administration is willing to do now, or if they will wait past the midterms, and as the presidential election approaches again, they would be more willing again to take more risk to deliver what Latin voters in the US would perceive as a strong victory. So all of these elements need to be taken into consideration when we analyze the kind of the incentives and constraints for the Trump administration.
Okay. It seems that the reaction, at least from the 8 million refugees who left Venezuela, at least from what we see on the mainstream media, very positive. Same within Venezuela?
Yeah, definitely the diaspora, those that have fled the regime for the economic collapse of fear of repression. There were celebrations across like US cities, but across Latin American cities in Spain, where most of these Venezuelans are concentrated in these different countries. What we had in Caracas, in Venezuela, was a much more muted reaction to some extent, in a sense that overnight when they like woke up Saturday morning, what's going on, the fear that there could be more strikes, the fact that since the regime is still in place, the repression apparatus still exists. So you didn't see as many or as large demonstrations in Venezuela. On the contrary, because there is still the regime apparatus, what you had were small demonstrations of what could be described as pro-government protesters. So they were demanding the release of Maduro. They were denouncing U.S. intervention. So that kind of thing happened inside Venezuela. But part of that is because there's still a lot of fear. And then today is Wednesday. Over the past 2-3 days, there are reports that the government is stepping up the crackdown. There seems to be journalists detained. There seems to be the colectivos are on the street harassing people. So it's still an environment of fear inside the country.
Mm-hmm. What does your gut tell you here about the general Venezuelan? Are they excited but just too afraid to show it, or are they affronted that their country's sovereignty was broken?
Yeah, I think a good proxy to understand Venezuelans' take on the regime and the outlook for change is the results that we had in the July 2024 election, right? So back then, 2/3 of Venezuelans voted for the opposition. So it's not an understatement to say that the majority of the population opposes the regime and would like to see regime change. But given what we had was just the removal of the regime leader, Maduro, but the regime is still there, they are not in a position to go out on the streets and demonstrate, or to celebrate, or even to demand the ousting of the new president, right? So, but if you think that that's what the election result was, that there are, yes, kind of more Venezuelans than not that would be happy to see Maduro go.
Okay. In just a second, I'm going to ask about kind of the rest of the world's reaction to this, especially the other countries in South America, one of which you live in right now. Let me just ask you this. So the country lost about 1/5 of its population, right? Those 8 million that left. Do you expect a material amount of those people to start making their way back to Venezuela, either now or after democratic elections, or are those people gone?
Yeah, for now, I don't think that would be the case because, as I said before, the regime is still in place, so they wouldn't go back to the kind of the same situation that they fled initially. I think that if we have a transition to democracy, the opposition wins, it takes office, and then let's say for the first 3 to 6 months, perhaps a year, there is stability, then it's more likely that you will begin to see a return of these immigrants that left the country because of the repression and the economic kind of meltdown and all those kind of negative impacts that we saw over the past 10 years. But I think that it will still take time, and there will likely need to be clear evidence that the situation has changed, that the outlook is positive, that there is room for improvement, economic growth, job generation, because these are people that were starving, actually. Like, you had measures in kind of the crisis so severe that there were indicators showing the average weight loss of people in Venezuela because they don't have access to food. So that's what people fled from, right? So I think they're only going to come back to when they have at least a perception that their lives can get better in Venezuela.
That they'll be able to actually eat, yeah, at least. Do you, I know we're sort of pontificating here, but do you expect, if we get to that stage where the diaspora starts reversing and these people come back in, especially those who have been in wealthier nations, US or some of the other wealthier LATAM countries, do you expect that to be a catalyst for sort of accelerating democratic change inside Venezuela? Because obviously they're coming back because they left because they didn't like the regime. They're coming back having lived in much more open societies, probably enjoying a taste of what they got. Maybe they have more resources as a result too. So, you know, I know it's going to take a while, if never, to get to that stage. But if it were to start to happen, is that something that would be an accelerating for catalytical change?
Yeah, it could be one of the variables, definitely, because when we think even about from the economic side, part of this large kind of immigration amounts to brain drain as well, right? So many Venezuelans that were kind of highly trained, that had degrees, technical degrees for the oil and gas sector, including, they have left the country. So when you bring people back, you have more, all beyond the humanitarian aspect of it, you start to have more kind of resources to rebuild the country. And as you said, you have more and more engaging civil society. You have people demanding transparency, fight corruption. So all of that could indeed help. But again, as you mentioned, I think this is many steps further down the line until we get to that point.
Okay. All right. So we saw that a lot of the Venezuelan refugees celebrating this. How about the rest of South America? I know Maduro wasn't loved. So maybe there's some countries that are happy to get him off the board, but no country likes the thought that, hey, the US could come in and remove me if they all of a sudden decide they don't like me. You live in a country, Brazil, which is kind of on that list. Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, those are kind of the countries that even Trump himself and Rubio have said, yeah, those leaders should probably not be sleeping as well right now. Yeah. So what has the reaction been from the rest of LATAM? And then we'll talk about the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that there is a sense that Maduro was already pretty much isolated, especially following the 2024 presidential elections, because basically no country in the Western Hemisphere acknowledged the results. They did not recognize him as president-elect. But there was that limbo that at the same time that they did not recognize, there was not much that they would do to force him out. There were attempts by Brazil and Colombia to try to negotiate a new election. This did not succeed. So there is a sense that Maduro going is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that the sentiment that prevails is a concern over what the US operation opens a precedent in terms of the violation of the sovereignty of countries in the region, right? Because that was a US unilateral decision to go in, extract him and take to the US. And all of this, the debate that we have in international law, international organisms, is that under international law, countries can only engage in a military action against another country in two situations. One is when they are attacked and then they are just responding. And two, if there is the approval of the United States Security Council. So for example, let's say, oh, there is a genocide in a country anywhere in the world. There is a group that is systematically killing a smaller part of the population. The United States Security Council can authorize the deployment of military troops to prevent that from happening. In this case, the argument is that none of these two situations occurred because there was no United Nations Security Council approval. And there is the argument that Venezuela did not attack the United States. But from the Trump administration, the argument is, well, Venezuela was providing, was a corridor to provide drugs to the United States.
Right.
This was a risk to the national security, and therefore we are in a position to step in. So there are two sides of the argument. When we look from the Latin American countries, the concern is, well, they did this in Venezuela, they might as well just do this in other countries as well. And I think that the two countries that would be on the top of the list for a similar action, not an extraction like Maduro, but airstrikes against drug trafficking sites, would be Colombia, which is the main producer of cocaine in the world. And the fact that, as you mentioned, Colombia has a leftist president who has been a stark critic of President Trump. He has opposed the strikes on boats. He has denounced what he described as the kidnapping of Maduro. Trump and him have exchanged kind of heated public statements. So there is the outlook that there could be drone strikes against drug trafficking sites in Colombia, and to some extent Mexico as well, because Mexico is the main source of fentanyl. So when you think about Colombia, Venezuela, we are talking about cocaine. When you think about Mexico, there's also fentanyl. And in Mexico, President Claudia Sheinbaum has repeatedly said she would oppose any sort of unilateral military intervention. So it's a tricky situation. And then we have to see how it evolves, but it's more likely than not that we'll see some sort of military operation in remote areas of these countries in 2026.
Okay. I'm resisting continuing to go down that thread, but just given the time, I'm going to jump to the rest of the world. So, obviously China, Russia, not thrilled about this for a whole bunch of reasons. And so they've voiced their strong displeasure. Beyond them, how is the rest of the world reacting to this?
Yeah, it's interesting because for both Russia and China, this is a two-edged sword, because Venezuela was an ally. Russia provided arms for decades to Venezuela. Now Venezuela provided oil to China. China lent a lot of money to Venezuela. But if we take a step back and we analyze what this military operation and the extraction of Maduro represents more broadly, it shows that the US is willing to exert strong influence, if not dominion, on the Western Hemisphere. This was outlined in the National Security Strategy, a document that was published late in 2025, that the Trump administration thinks that for national security reasons, Washington needs to have, we can even talk about, like, to some extent, control of the hemisphere, of the Western Hemisphere. That means, or at least suggests, that the US is willing to be less present, in other parts of the globe. And it's more comfortable that other superpowers also exert power in their areas of influence, in their backyard, so to speak. So from that perspective, that's a good thing for Putin in Moscow and in Russia, and for Xi in Beijing in China, because they have military aspirations, as we know, in Ukraine and also in Taiwan. China has long said it aims to unify China, so bring Taiwan under the authority of Beijing. So the precedent that this operation sets is also a positive for them in that regard. And then talking about the world more broadly, I think it goes in line with what we said before, that no one is sad to see Maduro go, so no one is really kind of opposing that aspect. But a lot of countries, especially from Europe, for example, they have underscored the risks of violating international law. Because if you start violating that persistently, you end up in the jungle world, so to speak, right? There are no rules and everyone can do as they please. And then this is not necessarily helpful to the maintenance of the kind of a more stable relation between countries.
Mm-hmm. Now, well, okay. I'm curious, does RANE have an opinion? And let's put good or bad aside for a moment. But if America were to continue to pursue this Monroe Doctrine, maybe Monroe Doctrine on steroids, we really want to, have primacy in the Western Hemisphere. I'm sure U.S. still wants to keep its toehold in a lot of other places still, but hold to them less lightly than we did before, but really lock in the Western Hemisphere, really, exploit all of its resources, protect it with a Golden Dome missile shield. We've got 2 massive oceans on either side. Kind of to your point, we care a little bit less about what happens in the rest of the world as long as we're controlling our hemisphere and running it the way that we want it to. Would that work for America? Like, is that a strategy that would actually make America stronger, safer, et cetera, than it is today?
Yeah, from our analytical perspective, like setting aside if it's like good or bad, when we think about what this can translate in terms of business impacts, it's the kind of thing that you have pros and cons. I think basically like everything, right? Because if you think that there will be this stronger focus on the Western Hemisphere, that the Trump administration will seek to work more closely with, even if just right-wing governments, more allied governments, that would likely create opportunities for U.S. companies. We are seeing at least the plan to revamp the Venezuelan oil and gas sector. There will likely be a lot of obstacles to that, and the plan may not work, but that could become an opportunity for U.S. oil majors there. Venezuela has a lot of mineral riches as well, from gold to diamonds to...
Yeah, it's ridiculously wealthy in natural resources. Yeah,
exactly. But we can also think about other countries with like Argentina with natural gas in Vaca Muerta. There is Paraguay that has cheap energy and can become a hub for data centers.
Right.
So there are...
sorry to interrupt, but I mean, is there an interest in Latin and South America in this Monroe Doctrine? Like, hey, if America were to say, yeah, we're gonna take as much of our manufacturing away from China and Asia as we can, and invest it in Latin and South America, are there countries there saying, yeah, let's do that? Like, I'll raise my hand.
Yeah, basically in Latin America, historically, what we have is governments that do not have enough resources to develop their own industries, and that they rely on foreign investment to do so. So, of course, there is issues like corruption, regulatory obstacles, a lot of protectionism in some countries like Brazil and Argentina are very protectionist because they don't want to open their manufacturing sectors to foreign competition, because that could lead to the bankruptcy and the collapse of their own domestic sectors. But aside all of these obstacles, the countries are open to foreign investment. What we have seen over the past decades is that China has become the main source of foreign direct investment in basically all of South America and many countries in South America as well. The US, given the much closer link to the region for centuries, is still when you look about what we call the stock, so what has been invested over time, the US still is the leader. So a lot of US companies are present here. They still have an influence on policy making because they are able to lobby. So they do not oppose that. The issue with the Monroe Doctrine is not that it can bring cooperation, is the way that the relationship is established, that it's much more around coercion and pressure rather than cooperation. Prior to what we are seeing as this resurgence, and a lot of people are calling the Dawn role because of Donald Trump, the kind of one of the main principles of the US foreign policy was what they called shared prosperity, was the idea, exactly as you're saying, that through cooperation and investment, if US companies or US resources would improve the quality of life, improve the economic conditions in the countries in the region, people would be more inclined to stay in their countries because they have a better life, they have a better prospect, than emigrate, for instance, to the US illegally.
Right.
So that was a way to frame the relationship that focused more on cooperation rather than coercion. Now what we'll likely see is more like the threats of tariffs, the threats of sanctions, and even perhaps military threat as a way to get the countries in the region to stick to Washington's interests.
And I guess TBD, it was more carrot. Now the stick's getting introduced. Will it be more stick going forward, or is this just an interim time to get everybody to line up and then it goes back to more carrots? TBD. There's a lot of discussion here in the live chat about Taiwan and its semiconductor importance to the U.S. And what I'm wondering, and this is just me thinking in real time aloud here, is if indeed that this is the vision of the U.S., unite the Western Hemisphere in the way that the Monroe Doctrine sort of envisions. Could Trump be talking to Russia and talking to China and saying, hey guys, say whatever you need to say publicly about what I just did here. And by the way, I'm not going to let you get, a real permanent foothold in Latin America. You're just going to have to suck it up. But Russia, I'm working with you to end the Ukraine war. You're going to end up with a big chunk of Ukraine, right? China, I know you want Taiwan. I'll let you have it eventually. Just give me 5 or 10 years so that we can build our own, domestic chip manufacturing to the point where we're not so dependent on Taiwan. Do you think there's some of that backdoorism going on, saying, hey, yeah, everybody can kind of own their part of the world here now?
Yeah, I think it's less of an open and blunt kind of statement, but that's what the indications and the acts transpire, right? So even though the US or US officials or Trump are not necessarily saying, as you framed this, as you kind of phrased out loud, that's the kind of the messaging that the other sides start to understand, perhaps act upon. So of course, it's early to say that that's what the outcome will actually be, and that either Russia or China will take decisive action and do similar military operations targeting the leaders of Ukraine or Taiwan. It's not necessarily that outcome, but the perception that the world order is changing and it's giving them more room to exert influence in their kind of own backyard, so to speak. Okay.
Mario, I'm looking at the time. We got about 7 minutes until the hour. I've still got a few questions, and I'd love to grab some from the audience. Can you go a little bit long, or do we have a hard stop at the hour?
I could go like 10 more minutes, maybe.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk about Venezuela's oil industry here. So it's a little debated because of the quality of the oil, but it's sort of globally accepted that Venezuela has the greatest oil reserves in the world. A lot of it's really heavy crude, super heavy crude even. Good news for the US, though, is we have refineries that specialize in that. So if we are now essentially taking over the running of Venezuela's oil industry, and saying, hey, maybe at some point in time, Venezuela, we give it back to you, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to run it. We're going to revitalize it. We're going to dramatically increase the output. You're going to benefit. Our companies that are doing this are going to benefit. We're also going to make sure that Venezuelan oil doesn't get to our enemies the way that it was, right? You said it was 4% of China's oil imports. What's the import of this? And how fast can this be brought up to a notably greater production than it is today? I've heard a lot in the past couple of days of manage your expectations because this infrastructure is pretty creaky and rusty.
Exactly. I think that's one of the main challenges. We saw reports yesterday and today that the Trump administration will have meetings with oil companies, executives on Friday. And that's what Trump outlined in the press conference, that the idea is that you bring in private sector money to rebuild the infrastructure of the Venezuelan oil sector. And from there, of course, since Venezuela has 17% of the world's reserves, you can just get oil pumping, and that would pay for their investments, that would pay for compensations for prior expropriations that happened in Venezuela, and that would be a way that everyone is able to make money and kind of be happy with it, so to speak. But as you said, there are operational challenges because the oil is actually super heavy, so it's not cost efficient. The cost of extraction is higher than in other areas and other types of oil. You have a scenario in which companies, given the current low oil prices, they are not at a moment in which they are willing to carry out large investments. So even putting Venezuela aside, regular projects, this is a moment of much more constraint from a budgetary perspective than of investing large sums of money.
Right.
If you think that there are like third-party data showing that it would take $110 billion to rebuild the Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and it will likely take between 10 to 15 years to get production, etc., to get to a significant increase, to say double production, or at maybe get like 3 times higher than what it is today, which is what it had in the early 2000s. So we're talking about a lot of money and kind of a long time frame. And the long time frame is important because that would require a stable political environment. So a company is comfortable with injecting that large sum and kind of believe that we'll just reap the benefits a decade down the road, a decade and a half. And that's not the scenario we have in Venezuela right now. We have, of course, Maduro has been removed, you have a new president, but as we were discussing earlier, she can be ousted by the military. She can face protests for being too friendly to the US. There could be a transition to democracy and the opposition gets to power, but is not able to govern. There can be an armed conflict. So this kind of wide range of scenarios of high uncertainty, they are also constraints for companies to invest. And then just to wrap, even from a legal perspective, you could get US companies access to Venezuelan oil and gas assets. Let's say the Venezuelan government allows that. But a lot of those assets that are currently sanctioned, the companies don't have the authorization from the US Treasury Department to operate. But the assets there belong to other companies. There are companies from Russia, from China, from other countries, from Europe even, that they hold stakes in oil fields. Let's say the government can just say, okay, I'm handing over to US companies. This could easily become a matter of litigation in international courts. Or even the fear that, well, now Trump is in power, the Venezuelan government agreed, they start investing, and then let's say Trump leaves office, there is a military coup in Venezuela, and then the new government just nationalizes it all over again.
All over again, yeah.
Yeah, so like for a private company, it's a kind of high stakes scenario to follow through with this plan. So that's why we see that these constraints will significantly limit the outlook that this will actually be a successful effort.
Okay, so Cliff here asks, it's being reported on U.S. news that U.S. oil companies were not consulted on taking control of Venezuela oil. Oil executives saying the cost is over 200 billion investment required. So it can be debated, 100 billion, 200 billion. First off, do you know whether or not they were consulted or not about this beforehand?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be the case that there was a formal consultation. There were reports in December that the Trump administration was having informal conversations, but this is not the case that, for example, they had a plan, that they outlined the plan and that the companies had agreed to it. It doesn't seem to be the case indeed. Even so that the reports, the more recent reports, is that on Friday there will be a meeting between Trump officials, Trump himself, with oil executives. So certainly this is not something that there has been an agreement upon as of now.
Okay. So Cliff then follows up with a question that says, well, what if the oil companies say thanks, but no thanks? What I have heard, and I can't imagine this wouldn't have to be part of the solution, is that a lot of the build out's going to be subsidized initially by the U.S. government. And Trump has actually mentioned this directly and said, there could be various ways in which the U.S. could be reimbursed from that, either out of future profits or whatever. But that, to your point, the companies, which of course, if they can make money, they'll do it happily. A good chunk of the lifting might be done by the government financially to make this happen. Let me ask you this, Mario. So let's assume for a moment that things don't go well with Venezuela and U.S. relations from here, but possession is 9/10 of the law. U.S. is now running Venezuela's oil infrastructure, at least its offshore oil infrastructure. The threat the U.S. always has is, hey, you do anything to sabotage what we're doing here, and we're just going to rain, military hellfire down on you. So could there be if things went sour, do you envision one of the more likely options would be that you've got a country, but its oil reserves offshore are run by another country that is basically saying, don't mess with us, or else you're going to regret it?
Yeah, I think there could be a kind of...
Let's hope it doesn't get to that stage, but is that how it might play out?
There could be different arrangements, but more likely, if it comes to a scenario in which the current government is not willing to cooperate or things don't play out, it's more likely that the U.S. will put pressure to then get to regime change than to operate. Because the issue is that in Venezuela, a lot of the oil are in the Orinoco River oil belt. So the Orinoco oil belt in Orinoco is a river. So they're not necessarily offshore, they are inland.
Okay.
So it's not just that you can have vessels and naval ships kind of protecting offshore assets. There is offshore production, but it's not just offshore. So it's not as simple as having a government in place and having the oil infrastructure aside from it.
Okay. All right. Well, look, folks, if you've got any other questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat here, and I'll ask them in the last couple of minutes we have here with Mario. Mario, is there anything that's on your radar that I haven't thought to ask you about in terms of this very fluid situation?
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground here, just in terms of the scenarios that we have. We have outlined 5 scenarios for how we see the situation likely evolving. And then if you want, I can just very briefly outline them just to have in mind how things can play out. And one is in which the new president cooperates with the US and remains in power. Again, we are talking about 3 to 6 months. There is a scenario in which she defies Washington, then the US resumes the military campaign, and then this is a very uncertain scenario because you don't know if the regime stands.
Yep.
There is one that the hardliners oust the president, consolidate power, and then there is kind of this tension with the US. The 4th scenario is basically the regime collapsing. Rather than a regime change, the regime collapsing. You have infighting, you have different groups controlling parts of the military and paramilitary apparatus, and then this just evolves to an internal armed conflict and basically chaos.
Okay, so that's the failed state scenario, right?
Exactly, that's a failed state scenario. And then the least likely is a scenario in which there is a transition, a democratic transition, and the opposition takes power. And this is very unlikely, especially when we think about a shorter time frame. This could happen further down the line, but for now, it's still highly unlikely.
Okay. All right. There was a funny question here for you. What's the U.S. going to do about all those drugs flooding our country from Greenland? And I know that's being said sarcastically, but you and I talked super briefly before we turned the camera on, Mario. I would actually, to the extent there is interest, and so folks indicate in the live chat or in the comments if you're watching the replay how interested you are. I'd be happy to reach out to RANE and get someone on from your North America team to talk about the situation with Greenland, and certainly post Venezuela, the administration's been dialing up its past chest beating, saying that it wants to annex Greenland one way or the other. So I guess I'll work with you and your colleagues to set that up if indeed folks are interested. But just real quick, Mario, a lot of people kind of roll their eyes when Greenland comes up, but I don't think RANE thinks that it's a laughable issue, meaning that there probably is something that's going on there, and there probably is something that's going to happen there at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when this first came up, everyone was like, how serious is the Trump administration being about this? And what we have seen since, and especially after the developments with Venezuela, is that the Trump administration is willing to take risk and is willing to adopt measures that in the past were considered improbable, disruptive, but to exert and to put in practice what it has outlined as its national security strategy to defend the national interest. And then, of course, when you think of Greenland, its strategic position in the Arctic, how it connects to Russia, to China, to kind of mineral resources. And then when you think about the Europeans and NATO, so it's a highly contentious issue. And I'm sure one of my colleagues would be happy to delve into that, because it's certainly enough to discuss for over an hour again.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you. And look, I don't know much about this, so I'm looking forward to getting educated by your analyst there. And I don't mean to sound callous, but I kind of think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there's just certain lines that the country is just not going to accept, right? Okay, we're not going to accept Russian nukes right off our shores, right? Where if the U.S., forget Trump specifically for a second, got to the point where it said, look, we're just too strategically vulnerable to our adversaries on some part of the North America, some part of our hemisphere. We can't let that stand. And yeah, we want to be nice guys, but if we're talking about 50,000 people, surely we can either come to some arrangement where we make them all millionaires, and everybody's happy, or if not, we find some way to be. I guess my point is, we're not going to let 50,000 people get in the way of protecting our what we consider to be a vulnerability in a key flank.
Yeah, indeed, that seems to be the position of at least some people inside the administration, and that they are willing to act under that premise.
Okay. All right. Well, look, Mario, I can't thank you enough. These updates are so useful and valuable, especially in such a fluid situation. I would love to have you back on again in the future. I'm gonna hope, don't take this personally, I'm gonna hope it's not soon, in the sense that I hope we're not reacting to some unfortunate new development like a coup inside the country or something like that. But obviously, anything material that happens, I would love to have you back on this channel to do this again for the audience.
Yeah, it would be a pleasure to join you again, and it's always great to have these conversations. So thanks for having me.
All right. Well, folks, please express your thanks to Mario for coming on and doing this for us. Please also hit that like button and click on the subscribe button below if you haven't already, as well as that little bell icon. Mario, for folks that would like to follow you in your work in between now and your next appearance on this channel, where should they go?
Yeah, we can always reach out to RANE at ranenetwork.com or reach out to the email info@ranenetwork.com.
All right, fantastic. Mario, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for going a bit late. Always super useful and valuable. Really appreciate it, my friend.
My pleasure.
All right, and everybody else, thanks so much for watching.
Central banks are making out of US dollars and out of US treasuries into gold. And that has been the primary driver of the gold bull market. And gold has outperformed the S&P so far in the 21st century, 25 years. And this is going to accelerate. And not only is it going to accelerate among central banks, but institutional investors and retail investors are going to finally start to participate. So, you know, a $10,000 gold price is not that far off. You know, it's only about a triple from here. But you know, I think it could easily be done over the next, you know, maybe 3 to 5 years.
Central banks are set for a fourth straight year of heavy gold buying, with around 1,000 metric tons expected in 2025 as they shift away from dollar assets amid U.S. policy and geopolitical risks. In Q2 2025 alone, they bought 166 tons, 41% above normal levels, showing the urgency of this move. A World Gold Council survey found 95% of reserve managers expect gold holdings to rise in the next year, with 43% planning to add more, while many see the dollar's role declining over the next 5 years in favor of gold, the euro, and the yuan. Peter Schiff is a well-known economist, investor, and financial commentator, highlights that gold miners have surged over 50%, far outpacing bullion's 25% gain, with ETFs like GDX and GDXJ still trading at low valuations despite strong earnings growth. A Reuters poll sees gold averaging $3,220 in 2025 and $3,400 in 2026. Silver is up 32% this year, nearing $40, its highest in 14 years. He mentions that the S&P may be up about 10% this year, but with the dollar down the same amount, international investors see no real gains in U.S. stocks. In contrast, this performance gap signals a shift of capital away from the U.S., as both foreign and American investors redirect money abroad. Gold and silver mining stocks have been standout performers, up nearly 80% and on pace to possibly double this year, outperforming tech, crypto, and every other sector, yet largely ignored by mainstream media. Looking ahead, while developed markets like Europe and Asia have led in 2025, emerging markets remain undervalued and could be the big story of 2026. As we present clips from the video, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell to stay instantly notified every time we upload a new video. Thanks for the support, and enjoy the video.
Well, I mean, look, the inflation is going to erode away most of the investment returns. Yeah, the S&P 500 is up 1.5% today, but the dollar's down 1%. So, you know, it's really only 0.5% if you measure it in other currencies, and that's how investors around the world are looking at it. But meanwhile, foreign stocks are doing a lot better. Look at gold stocks, which, you know, gold stocks are up another 2% on the day, but they're up 77% year to date. That's the GDX and GDXJ. And, you know, so this is indicative of, you know, the Fed being too loose. And, you know, gold is up today, but it's still, you know, below 3,400. Silver is now back above $39. But I think silver is getting ready to blow through 40. And I think gold's getting ready to blow through 3,500. Well, the economy is not booming, and nor is it going to boom at all during the Trump years. But in order to cure the problems that he inherited and that he contributed to during the 4 years he was president, right? He doesn't come to this thing with clean hands. But in order to fix the problems, we actually need a bust, right? We need the bust before we can have the boom. Trump wants to skip the bust and go right to the boom, which you can't do. All you can have is a bubble. So rather than have a legitimate economic boom, Trump just wants to inflate another bubble so he can pretend that the economy is booming, even though we're just blowing air into a bubble.
Yeah. And so you mentioned a bust. How bad could this bust look? Like how bad could it be?
Horrific. I mean, much worse than 2008. I mean, we have a huge debt bubble, and when it pops, there's a lot of disaster in its wake. I mean, there's going to be a lot of defaults, a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of failures. Look, stocks are going to crash, bonds are going to crash, real estate's going to crash. Look, a lot of bad, painful things have to happen to fix this problem. That's why the problem's not going to get fixed, because the politicians don't have any stomach for that pain, because it might mean that they don't get reelected. And of course, that's the only pain they care about is their own pain. And so they're going to kick the can down the road with another sugar high. And that's the Fed is now cooperating, cutting rates. By next year, they'll be in QE mode. Yeah, well, I think the S&P is maybe up around 10% this year, which is about how much the dollar is down. So if you're an international investor, you're looking at no return on U.S. stocks. Meanwhile, I look at my mutual funds. I have 5 mutual funds. One of my mutual funds is called the Euro-Pacific International Dividend Payers Fund. And we buy dividend paying stocks outside the United States. So, higher dividend paying stocks. So typically these are more conservative type stocks. So they're not growth oriented. We're buying them because they pay good dividends. Well, that fund year to date is almost up 40% now. 40%. Now, yeah, about 10% of that is foreign exchange related. But still, that is, a huge performance gap. I mean, basically, we're making 4 times the money investing in foreign stocks as we would be investing in the S&P. And that is a big signal to capital allocators around the world to jump on board this train. And so I think you're going to see a lot of money leaving the U.S. markets. Money that has been sucked into the U.S. markets for the past 10, 12 years is now going to get sucked out. And that means foreigners who have U.S. investments are going to sell their U.S. investments and bring their money home. But then Americans are going to sell their U.S. investments and send their money abroad. And so that's what's really going to be helping. I mean, my asset management company, Euro Pacific Asset Management, because that's what we specialize in. And again, gold stocks are up now close to 80% on the year, 77% for the GDXJ. This is the best year on pace that I can remember. I mean, there may have been a better year in the early 1970s, mid 1970s, but this, I think, is the biggest year, single calendar year that I can remember on pace. Because I think we could finish the year where the GDX and GDXJ, these are indexes, double in value, 100% gain in a single year. And gold stocks year to date are the best performing sector, gold and silver mining stocks in the U.S. stock market. They're beating tech, right? They're beating crypto. They're beating whatever. Like whatever you think is the best, it's not. It's gold and silver mining stocks, and they're getting no coverage. If you watch the mainstream financial media, you'd have no clue that these stocks were doing so well. We've been way overweight Europe, and we have investments in Southeast Asia, including Japan. And we have some money in South America and in Canada, But I think we're going to probably be allocating a little bit more into the emerging markets. We have an emerging market fund that concentrates. And the emerging market fund is my least performing fund. Year to date, it's up, in the low 20s, which is still beating the U.S. by double, more than double. But the emerging markets haven't done as well this year as the developed markets. I think that may change in 2026. So I think we're probably going to allocate a little bit more into the EM for next year, because I think that's going to be a big 2026 story, is going to be the outperformance of emerging markets, because they're still really, really cheap compared to developed markets, and even cheaper compared to the U.S. market. Well, I mean, I think silver's looking pretty strong. I mean, we're just around $39. There's obviously some resistance up there. But if we can break through it, I mean, we're not quite at a 52-week high today. We didn't quite make the highs. But we'll see what happens next week. I mean, I know that these metals are basing, but silver is very cheap. And so I've been a real promoter recently, last 6 months in particular, even before, when it was 100 to 1, when silver was, when you could get 100 ounces of silver for 1 ounce of gold. And, it's not quite that cheap anymore, but it's still historically cheap. So I really like silver.
U.S. assets currently dominate global portfolios, accounting for nearly half of the investable market. However, rising concerns over U.S. weakening dollar returns are prompting investors, particularly in Europe, Japan, Sweden, and Australia, to explore alternatives like gold, Chinese tech, and emerging markets. Risk hedging via currency strategies is gaining traction as the dollar's depreciation erodes dollar-denominated returns. Peter reveals that China still offers plenty of cheap stocks, and with growing weight in emerging market funds, it's positioned to come out of the global trade war stronger, forming deeper ties with Russia, India, Africa, and even Latin America, while U.S. influence weakens. Meanwhile, U.S. tariffs, like the 50% duty on Indian goods, ultimately hurt American consumers and strain foreign partnerships. Commodities are set for a major boom as inflation rises and the dollar weakens. Energy, oil, natural gas, and agriculture all look cheap now, but demand will surge, especially from emerging markets that benefit from a weaker dollar. Instead of exporting to the U.S., these nations will increasingly produce and consume goods domestically, driving up demand for energy and resources. While this supports global growth, it also means higher commodity prices for Americans, many of whom will be priced out due to the declining dollar.
And so
I think there's still a lot of cheap stocks in China. You know, we have some Chinese exposure in our funds, and especially in our emerging market fund where we're overweight China. But yeah, I mean, I think that China is going to come out of this, global trade war as the winner. I think that they're going to strengthen their trading relationships with the rest of the world. They're going to form better alliances with Russia, with India. This is going to be to the detriment of the U.S. And I think they're going to have stronger relationships in Africa and maybe even in our own back door in South America. You might see that the Chinese gaining additional inroads in Latin America because they're not going to be trading as much with the United States. It's not just that we shot ourselves in the foot. I mean, we're shooting ourselves in the head. Put 50% tariffs on India, 50%. Now, again, the tariffs aren't on India. They're on Americans who buy Indian goods. But it still is a problem for Indian companies that wanted to sell American goods because now their goods are 50% more expensive if the Americans want to buy them. Yeah, well, first of all, if countries stop buying oil from Russia, it's just going to make oil more expensive because if they have to buy it someplace else, you're just going to shift the demand and we're going to end up paying higher prices. Ultimately, Russia is going to sell the oil anyway. It's going to get it out of the country. So it doesn't make any sense to put those sanctions on. And all it does is piss off people. Like it gives people another reason to get out of the dollar and get out of U.S. treasuries. I mean, countries don't like being sanctioned. They don't like being pushed around. I mean, we wouldn't like it either if some other country was doing it to us. America benefited from other countries using our currency. We got the seigniorage gain. We got artificially low interest rates too, and we got lower consumer prices. But we're pushing all that away. We're, biting the hands that have been feeding us. So it's generally not a good idea to do that. And they also, need to hedge against Bitcoin if they have some of that. That's the stupidity too, because a lot of people in America, instead of buying gold the way they're buying it in India or China, they've been buying fool's gold, aka Bitcoin. And that's been a problem because when the Bitcoin bubble pops, a lot of these people who thought they were buying something like gold, they're going to find out that they weren't. So that's unfortunate because Americans don't own enough gold, either because they own Bitcoin or they own nothing. But owning Bitcoin is basically like owning nothing because that's all you got when you own Bitcoin is nothing. I think energy is cheap, natural gas, oil is cheap, agricultural commodities. I'm bullish pretty much on the whole complex of commodities. They're all going to be bid higher with all this inflation. And especially, as the dollar really tanks, if emerging markets are a main beneficiary of a weaker dollar, then they're going to consume a lot more commodities because, they're going to start consuming more of their own production. Instead of exporting stuff to America, they're going to build stuff and keep it. But I think there's going to be a lot more energy because they're going to produce a lot of things that are more energy and resource intensive. when they're no longer just exporting trinkets to America. They're producing goods for their own consumers. So, we could see a real boom in commodities. And of course, this means that commodities are going to be a lot more expensive for Americans too. Just a lot of Americans won't be able to afford to buy them. They'll be priced out of the market.
Central banks' record gold buying, weakening U.S. dollar returns, and the outperformance of foreign equities and commodities all point toward a structural shift in global capital flows. Gold and silver miners, alongside emerging markets, are increasingly attracting attention as U.S. assets lose appeal. With inflation, tariffs, and geopolitical realignments reshaping trade and reserve strategies, the next few years could mark a turning point where hard assets and non-U.S. markets take the lead. Could central bank demand alone be enough to push gold toward the $10,000 target? How will the shift of capital into emerging markets and commodities affect long-term U.S. economic influence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to subscribe for future updates, and if you found this content valuable, a thumbs up would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for being part of this journey with us.
We're right at the end game. It could happen any month. It could happen in gold. It could happen in silver. I've always thought that it would happen in silver just because it's such a small market. Yeah, it's clearly a breakout. I would think silver's going to go at least to 50 and test that. I don't think longer term 50 is going to hold. I mean, we're going to go above 50, and then who knows what kind of numbers. And gold, I mean, there is no technical area or number because we're at all-time highs at this point, and just have to see where the next battle begins. But this is a breakout, and I view this as a worldwide vote of no confidence in paper. Even if we got to 45, 50 to 1, half of what the ratio is now, you'd be looking at what? $175 an ounce with gold at 3,500.
Yeah.
If you got to 50 to 1.
Bill Holter warns that we're already at the end game, and a failure to deliver could happen any month in gold, silver, or even other commodities. And because silver is such a small market, a failure to deliver event could happen at any time. This move in gold and silver looks like a true breakout, signaling a global loss of confidence in paper assets. Silver seems destined to test $50 soon, but longer term it's likely to push well beyond that level. With gold already in uncharted territory, there are no technical ceilings, only the next battle lines ahead. If the gold-silver ratio simply returns to 50 to 1 with gold at $3,500, silver would reach $175 an ounce. Bill Holter, a well-known precious metals commentator and analyst, points out that recently, a big shift has emerged in precious metals delivery. Instead of contracts shrinking between the first and final notice days, more buyers are now standing for delivery, sometimes even doubling or tripling the original amount. This exposes the weakness of the fractional reserve system, where only a small fraction of the metal needed actually exists for delivery. As more people demand physical metal, the chances of a failure to deliver event rise sharply. Once that happens, confidence in the system could collapse, because contracts that can't be fulfilled are effectively worthless. Gold and silver prices have long been suppressed to protect faith in the dollar and the U.S. Treasury's ability to borrow trillions each year. By keeping gold down, authorities maintained the illusion that the dollar was strong. But that strategy is unraveling as major sovereigns are selling U.S. treasuries and shifting into physical gold and silver. This move reflects a deeper recognition. According to Bill Holter, once confidence in paper assets breaks, demand will rush toward tangible value, and the system will struggle to contain it. As we present clips from the video, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell to stay instantly notified every time we upload a new video. Thanks for the support, and enjoy the video.
Right, it'll create more demand. And along with creating demand, not just paper demand, you're going to have more and more people buy contracts and then immediately stand for delivery. As a matter of fact, for the last 2 or 3 years now, it used to be, and I'll use silver as an example, it used to be that there were X amount of contracts standing for delivery on first notice day. And then by the time delivery day came, final notice day, the amount of contracts outstanding would have dwindled by 50% or more. Over the last 2 or 3 years, what has happened is you get X amount of contracts on first notice day, and then by the time of the last day, final notice comes, there's more contracts outstanding, and in some cases, there's more than double or triple the amount of contracts that were standing the first day. So you have buyers that have been coming in and immediately standing for delivery. And that's the Achilles heel to the fractional reserve system. I mean, there's no question. I mean, even the powers that be will admit, yes, it's a fractional reserve system. We really only have 5% or 10% of the metal or whatever it is available for delivery because not everybody stands for delivery. Well, we're at the point now where there's more and more understanding that because it's fractional reserve in nature, it will ultimately fail to deliver. And again, the psychology of human beings, when they're told they can't have something or they might not be able to have something, they want it even more. And it's going to cause a stampede of contracts standing for delivery, and that'll be your failure to deliver, which blows up the entire system, by the way. Because if you've got all these contracts that are actually worth zero because they cannot perform, it breaks confidence. And the reason, let me back up a little bit. The reason gold, and of course silver too, silver has been suppressed because they didn't want the fuse on gold lit. And they don't want the fuse on gold lit because if you've got $25,000, $50,000, $100,000+ per ounce for gold, that shows no confidence or a lack of confidence in the paper. On the other side of that, their confidence is absolutely needed in order for the U.S. Treasury to borrow the ridiculous sums that we've been borrowing. I mean, we have to borrow $2 trillion a year just to balance the books, just to keep the system afloat. So they suppress price of gold and then whack it. I mean, you remember, go back, 10 years ago, 15, even 20, 25 years ago, gold would start to pop its head up and then whack it, 1%, 2%, 3%, which back then when gold was $300, $400, a $10 move in gold was huge. And it was demoralizing to see all of a sudden gold was going higher and boom, they smashed it. Well, the reason they smashed it was because they want to be able to point at the price of gold and say, see, gold bad, dollar good. And that allowed the confidence for the rest of the world to buy treasuries and fund the U.S. deficit. At this point, that's starting to unravel because you're seeing some very big sovereigns liquidating U.S. treasuries and turning around and replacing that with either gold or silver.
Bill Holter explains that gold's rise over the decades isn't just about a bull market. It reflects the steady decline of paper currencies since the U.S. left the gold standard. The dollar index may look stable against other fiat currencies, but the real measure is against gold and silver, and in that sense the dollar has been steadily losing value. Authorities have even considered gold revaluations in the past to reflate debt-heavy systems, highlighting the constant need to fight deflation with inflation. Today, as debt burdens balloon, the same pressure is building again. Governments must inflate or die. At the same time, silver stands out as the most undervalued asset. Historically, silver traded around a 15 to 16 to 1 ratio to gold, close to its natural supply ratio of about 10 to 1. Yet today the ratio sits near 85 to 1, even spiking to 120 to 1 in recent years. This massive gap signals extreme undervaluation, with silver priced far below its historical and natural balance. Bill Holter summarizes all the above discussion by highlighting that combined with its essential uses in industry, medicine, and technology, silver's position today suggests enormous upside potential once the market corrects.
I mean, this has been going on. It's been going on and on and on. I mean, we've had a bull market, if you will, in gold. But the reality is it's been a bear market. It's been a diluting market in the dollar and other currencies ever since we went off the gold standard. I would think if the dollar should be bouncing and bouncing pretty hard right now, it's not. And what won't go up must go down. So I think there's another leg down. But again, I don't think the DXY is really a good index to look at because you're looking at dollars versus other paper currencies, the euro, the yen. The true measure is versus gold and silver. And that verdict is already in. Right, because gold was $20.67, and then they revalued. They took everybody's gold and they revalued it to $35. And that, there's a lesson to be had there. When they revalued gold from $20.67 to $35, that started to break the back of deflation. It was an inflationary event. And I mean, there's all kinds of talk wherever you look now about a gold revaluation worldwide. Well, what is that telling you? It tells you that they're desperately trying to reflate the system. And they have to reflate the system because of the amount of debt that's outstanding. And it all goes back to the late, great Richard Russell, inflate or die. I mean, in this system, we cannot have deflation. You cannot have deflation of assets because everything is held up on margin. And when assets deflate, you get a margin call, then the entire system comes down, and basically currencies become literally worthless because they're based on the full faith and credit of the issuer. And all of these issuers, from the United States to all the Eurozone, I mean, they're all bankrupt. They're all upside down and insolvent. A lot of hedge funds and family offices, they're knowledgeable. Not all of them, but a lot of them have been buying the physical metal.
I see.
Now, that said, I can say that for the last 9 months, even close to a year, the demand for physical metal out of North America has collapsed. But yet the price of gold, I mean, if you asked me 5 years ago or 10 years ago, is there any way gold could be, could run from 2,700 to 3,500 and North America be a net seller? I would have said no way because, it would stir up the greed factor. But what you're seeing is liquidations out of North America and whatever. I mean, I've gotten more sell orders in the last 9 months than I had cumulatively in the last 15 years. And I asked people, why are you selling? And I've only had maybe three people tell me, well, I'm going to take a profit. And I asked them, well, where are you going to put the money in a system that's going to mathematically collapse to keep it protected? And they're like, oh, well, when gold drops or silver drops, I'll go back in and I'll rebuy it. Well, good luck with that, because when there's a failure to deliver, there won't be anything to be had. And if you're not on the bus, you're off the bus and you can't get back on the bus. But the vast majority of people that I've asked have all said, I need the money. I need it to live on. So it tells me that the money on the streets in North America is evaporating or evaporated. Right, but they are both strategic metals. I mean, think about silver. Think about all the uses that silver has: medicinal, industrial, technological, monetary. I mean, there's so many uses for silver, and it is, in my opinion, silver is the most underpriced asset on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back,
and I say that because, Danny, gold. The reality is gold is the measuring stick. We got fooled. The world got fooled for 50 years that the measuring or more, that the measuring stick was the dollar. Everything was measured against the dollar. How many dollars? The reality is dollars themselves are measured against the ultimate measuring stick, which is gold. Yeah, and the reason I say silver is the most undervalued asset on the planet, I mean, for how many hundreds of years, and even in the U.S. Constitution, the ratio is 15 or 16 to 1. You could go back 1,000. Well, first off, silver comes out of the ground just under 10 to 1 to gold. So there's roughly 10 ounces of gold pulled out of the earth for every 1 ounce of gold.
1 ounce of silver.
That's God's ratio. Right. 10 ounces of silver for every 1 ounce of gold. Now, for hundreds of years, the ratio, the price ratio was 16 to 1. And the reason being, back 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago, in order to transport money, you had to transport gold or silver. But if you transported silver, you had to transport 10 times the amount of silver to get the same capital. So man discounted the silver price to 15, 16 to 1 to account for, the extra carts or carriages or whatever that you needed to transport silver.
In short, both gold and silver are flashing signals of deep cracks in the paper-based financial system. With debt loads soaring, currencies weakening, and physical supply inelastic, the pressure is building for a major repricing of precious metals. Silver, in particular, looks poised for dramatic gains once confidence in paper assets fades and investors rush toward tangible value. If a failure to deliver event occurs in silver, how quickly could it spread to gold and other markets? Could a government-led gold revaluation be the trigger that finally resets the global financial system? Share your thoughts on Bill Holter's analysis in the comments section below. If you find this video informative, please consider supporting us and turning on notifications to stay updated about our latest videos. See you in the following video. Thanks for watching.
Silver's breaking out. It looks like 44 is kind of that next upside target. And I got a feeling like when you look at the monthly chart of silver right now with silver, where I think we could go all the way up and we could see it spike. And I think we could get up to that $49, $50 an ounce in silver. I think it could have a blow off phase and shoot higher. Very similar to, what happens near the end of a move is you get a very strong parabolic move. And so I think right now in the precious metal space, money is actually chasing the gold miners and the silver miners. Gold's taking a pause. Money's rotating out of gold because it just had a nice move. And we're seeing it move into like silver miners and gold miners. You can see they're extending and pushing higher. And we were long SILJ. We just hit a 20% target yesterday. We've actually closed that position out. I think now we might see, miners take a bit of a breather and a pause. And as money rotates out of miners with some profit taking, we flip back to gold, and gold has got this little pause that it's just had, and now gold will probably shoot up. So I think they're going to like piggyback on each other. That flows into miners and then flows into gold and goes back and forth.
With $44 as the next objective, silver is currently in a great setup for a breakout. It may reach as high as $49.50 an ounce in a traditional parabolic. The story is being driven by breakthrough technicals, tightening supply, and industrial demand. According to Investing Haven's forecasts, silver will first challenge all-time highs, reaching about $49 in 2025. Money is shifting right now. Investors are pursuing silver and gold miners who have been rising in value, and gold has just rebounded, so they are taking profits there. In order to prepare for the next step higher, miners may now pause as profits are taken. This money might then turn back into gold. Chris Vermeulen is a market strategist and technical analyst. He points out that silver is in a good position. According to a recent commodity forecast, bulls are aiming for $44 if resistance is broken, and silver is now trading close to $42. Although silver is more speculative than gold, both are expected to continue to rise as a result of this rotation. Silver is breaking out, according to technical breakout assessments, both in terms of its absolute price and in relation to stocks from 4-year bases. In certain technical models, medium-term targets of $49 to $50 are repeated. At the same time, gold's consistent increase serves as a warning to markets about anxiety around the world. While IT giants continue to drive U.S. stocks to near high levels, internal weakness and exuberant sentiment point to the possibility of a significant correction in the near future. There are fissures in well-known industries, momentum and investor confidence are brittle, and valuations are high. Analysts warn that some profit-taking and sideways moves are typical following strong runs, in miners or metals. Although resistance has been breached by silver, further upside is contingent upon maintaining volumes and avoiding reversals. Chris believes when the cycle changes, investors need a strategy to identify trend reversals and safeguard their money. As we dive into the video, don't forget to hit the bell icon and subscribe so you don't miss any updates.
Yeah, if we take a look at silver, we haven't traded silver just because gold, our play around silver was the silver miners. And so silver has done the very similar to gold as it's rallied up, and now silver's had a nice bull flag. It's paused. And so silver's breaking out and starting to run. So money's coming, I think, out of miners now and starting to go into silver. And then I think it'll bleed over into gold because silver is much more speculative than gold. So money's going to rotate probably from miners, silver, gold, and then kind of maybe loop around. These are very nuanced, small moves. But silver's breaking out. It looks like 44 is kind of that next upside target. And I got a feeling like when you look at the monthly chart of silver, we're in a sweet scenario right now with silver where I think we could go all the way up and we could see it spike. And I think we could get up to that $49, $50 an ounce in silver. I think it could have a blow off phase and shoot higher. Very similar to, what happens near the end of a move is you get a very strong parabolic move. You cannot trust a move that goes straight up because usually it comes straight back down. Very similar to what happened just before the last financial crisis. It shot straight up, came straight back down, and then sold off for 65%. So I think we have that potential for it to shoot higher still. And of course, that'll be good for silver miners as well. But yeah, right now we're in that sweet spot for precious metals. And you and I have touched on this cycle graph before. If we look at the stock market, this blue cycle here, precious metals really come to life near a major market top. And one of the reasons is people are moving away from the stock market in general, and they're moving into physical assets, something where they won't lose value or won't blow up on them as much. And industrial capital goods are actually doing really well. When we look at the industrial space, businesses are still bullish, and industrial stocks are rocketing higher. Businesses think things are good. CEOs and factory workers or management are upgrading their facilities, thinking this is a little lull maybe for a lot of businesses before it goes higher. But I think the music's about to end, and when everybody's really bullish and they think businesses is just getting started, usually that's when the business goes for a nosedive. We go in for a recession, and they realize they just spent millions on new facilities or assembly lines and all that stuff right when all their demand decreases. So there's a lot of things coming together. And yeah, there's a few key currents. I think looking at the big picture might be important. I think the stock market is getting pretty frothy. If we look at the charts, we'll actually take a look at the big picture and actually go to gold first. So gold, in a nutshell, I'm just going to flip to the monthly chart. Gold has been on a tear, for a couple of years. It's outperforming. It's becoming one of the best performing assets long term. Last time we saw this was like in 2007, just before a major stock market and financial reset in the economy. Gold is kind of a barometer, a global barometer, like planet Earth and the people on it's like a beehive mentality. The whole world is nervous that something is about to happen, and they tend to move to gold. They move away from equities to some regard. They move away from currencies. They move away from even real estate. And they start to move to gold. They want something physical, something outside of the financial system. And gold is telling us that people are preparing for something bad to happen. We don't know what it is. We don't know, when the shoe is going to fall and trends are going to change. The economy situation is going to change. But gold has just been on this tear, and it's outperforming and it's extending to the upside. That is an early warning sign to be careful for the stock market. But if we zoom in now and go to the overall stock market, I'll go to like the SPY, which is the S&P 500 ETF. We've obviously had a very nice rally coming out of the lows from this year. We had the big 20+% sell-off. Now the markets are pushing near hitting all-time highs. And really people are buying into this market up here. I think it's kind of camouflaged with, Oracle has now kind of just came out of nowhere. And, Larry, he's like, you never really hear much about him, it seems, and now he's the wealthiest man in the world and he's like silent. And Oracle came out, and I think it's going to revigorate, some of the tech space and make people even more bullish on the market. And of course, it jumped like 30+% the other day. And so the markets are getting dragged up mostly by the big techs. We are seeing some broad market rally. We're seeing small caps. They've been moving up and equal weighted, but it still is really the magnificent seven. And so the stock market is in an uptrend. You do not want to fight it. You just need to have a game plan so that when things do stall out and price starts to roll over, first of all, you can identify when the trend up has come to an end and to have a game plan to at least avoid a crash or benefit from falling pricing. And then if we zoom into the shorter term here, Danny, we just look at the 30-minute chart really over the past week, the stock market has gone from this lime green, this oversold market condition where it's sold off too quick within this uptrend. Lime green is an indicator, is part of an indicator that tells me when the market is too oversold, is usually when value hunters step in, bargain hunters or institutions, and they buy it back up, and you can see it's rallied. And it's done this a couple of times. When we just zoom back here on the S&P 500, it can get sold off, it can get into this oversold condition, and it gets bought right back up again. So we're still in kind of that buy the dip mentality. We did have an interesting scenario yesterday where we had this red indicator, get above this blue line. This is my FOMO indicator. This is everybody seemed to be piling into the market yesterday. They don't care what price they pay. They're using market orders, which means they're buying at market and they don't care what price they pay. When there's a ratio and this red indicator goes over 3, it's telling me that people are just moving in and they believe the market's going higher and they don't want to be left behind. And so usually after that, we have a little bit of a pause or pullback. And really it's kind of, as soon as we got up into that territory, the market's really been trading sideways for this last day and a half. We might actually see it pull back a little bit for another day or so. So, you look at long-term gold, be aware the music will come to an end at some point. We look at the daily chart. It's up, but it's a very weak market.
Chris Vermeulen emphasizes that gold has had a strong run recently and is now pausing in a sideways bull flag, which often signals it's ready for another breakout soon. While money has rotated into silver and gold miners, those positions may see profit taking, with flows cycling back into gold. Chris prefers gold, whether physical or through ETFs. They warn that if equities drop sharply into a bear market, even gold could face temporary selling pressure from panic and margin calls, but it usually recovers faster than stocks. Current conditions resemble 2007, where gold continued to rally even as equities topped, suggesting more upside before any broader correction. Let's dive into the interview.
No, so if we look at gold, all it's done is, we can look at the 30-minute chart over the past week and a half. Gold has had this a very strong move. And after something's had a strong move, it's just taking a pause. I wouldn't say it's weakening. It's just taking a breather because it just had a hell of a run. It's exhausted. Right. There's just some profit taking. And so even when we look at the daily chart, which is very similar, we're just trading sideways. And it's a little tiny bull flag. It's primed and ready to shoot up literally, the next trading session, this thing could pop and run. And so I think right now in the precious metal space, money is actually chasing the gold miners and the silver miners. Gold's taking a pause. Money's rotating out of gold because it just had a nice move. And we're seeing it move into like silver miners and gold miners. You can see they're extending and pushing higher. And we were long SILJ. We just hit a 20% target yesterday. We've actually closed that position out. I think now we might see, miners take a bit of a breather and a pause. And as money rotates out of miners with some profit taking, we flip back to gold, and gold has got this little pause that it's just had, and now gold will probably shoot up. So I think they're going to like piggyback on each other. That flows into miners and then flows into gold and goes back and forth. That's what I think is going to unfold here. The problem is we're coming to a turning point, and when things turn, I don't want to hold anything. So I still like gold the most, physical gold or through an ETF. I think that has got good upside potential here. I think it still has 10 to 20+% upside. I also think because I have to hold it for a year, I think bonds like TLT would be a good position as well. So the bonds could come to life and really start a nice move up, and eventually it'd be nice to sell gold. And because when the stock market does roll over, eventually gold will most likely pull back with it. But gold holds its value fairly well. It doesn't drop as much as the stock market. So I would say like gold and bonds would be those plays. If you had a gun to my head and said you have to buy and hold, it's probably the two that I would do. Short term, typically we see gold, like we could see the stock market top out and potentially fall 10, 15% from here, and gold keeps going up another 10 or 20%. But eventually when the stock market falls a certain amount and people start to get really scared, there's real fear, we actually enter a bear market, then gold usually doesn't stand a chance. There's enough selling and margin calls and fear that even people sell off the good positions like gold. And so gold naturally will sell off temporarily, but it's usually short-lived. Gold only gets pulled down during an extreme wave of selling. It could last a few months in the markets, and then it'll find a bottom way before the stock market does. So yeah, gold is not immune to a bear market, but it can rally in this particular situation. 2007, which is a very similar situation as we have right now, when you look at from price charts and what the dollar is doing and what gold's doing in the stock market, the equities market could sell off and top at any point here, and gold just keeps on going another 20+%. So that's why I like gold at this point.
It is more crucial than ever to have a clear plan in place to safeguard profits and handle reversals as global uncertainty increases and stocks reveal underlying fractures. How likely is it that silver will maintain its pace toward $50 without seeing a dramatic reversal if it breaks over $44? In the event that U.S. stocks undergo a more severe decline, may gold and bonds serve as the most secure hedge? If you enjoy the content, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon for timely updates. We appreciate your support, and thank you for being with us.